As part of the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, the international community is trying to find a way to transform decades of agricultural progress and innovation into more resilient food systems. Well, this transformation must simultaneously offer better nutrition and prevent hundreds of millions more people from becoming food insecure, while protecting natural resources and finding ways to reverse the damage of the past. So how do we deal with the failings in the global food system, why it is important to keep in mind the environmental impact of food, and how do experts envision the future evolution of food? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by Greg Drescher, Vice President of the Culinary Institute of America, Flexitarians, Associate Vice President for Yale Hospitality, Peggy Chen, founder of Grassroots Initiatives, and Roy Steiner, Senior Vice President of the Food Initiative at the Rockefeller Foundation. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. So you are all experts on food, but according to a recent report, food systems have the potential to nurture human health and support environmental sustainability. However, they are currently undermining both. This is the opening statement of Eat Lancet, a report published last year. So what is wrong with the current food system? Why don't we start with Greg?
Sure. Well, we're mainly focused on food choices and trying to shape future food choices. And certainly one that immediately comes to mind is the impact of an overemphasis on animal agriculture and the impact that that has on climate change and other environmental issues. And then the question becomes, what's the strategy and how can we sort of flip the overemphasis on animal agriculture and bring up some of the more plant-based foods in our dietary patterns. That is not by any means our only challenge with the food system, but it's a big one.
Peggy, what is your take?
Yes, absolutely. And just from the social cultural part, people obviously, especially in the East, we have to remember that China and India only just recently emerged as an industrialized nation, and therefore people's mindsets are still based on equating meat to wealth. And so how much meat we can put on the table and what types of meats we're actually purchasing, consuming is defining the identity of a person's wealth. So that's a massive challenge to also overcome when it comes to adopting a plant-based diet here.
Rafi?
We have a food system and agriculture that produces massive amounts of food, yet we have food insecurity. We have tremendous amounts of innovation and efficiency in the system, yet the result of it is people that have all sorts of health-related, food-related health issues. In the United States alone, we spend about $180 to $190 billion on an annual basis for food-related health issues. And so the question of whether the food system is broken or not, I think it's fairly documented and it's proven that the current system is not producing food that is good for people. And ultimately also is not good for the planet, and that is also well documented through Eat Lancet reports and through other reports that have been published, scientific research.
And Roy, what are your thoughts on the food system that we are having now?
Yeah, as my colleagues have indicated, our food system is really failing to protect human health and failing to protect the planet. It is quite extraordinary that the food sector is the #1 emitter of global greenhouse gases. And, we can't solve climate change if we don't fundamentally transform the food system in multiple dimensions. But I think even similar to that, it is, diet is now the #1 risk for early mortality. The food we're eating is slowly killing us because we're eating food that we know is unhealthy, ultra-processed foods that are heavy in sugar and salt, etc. We've got to be able to change and create a food system that nourishes both human beings as well as nourishes the planet.
But some of the things that you mentioned, for example, we're addicted to sugar and salt. We would like to eat more meat. That's part in our gene, isn't it? Or is it should we blame the food industry for putting those food on our plates? Greg?
Well, one of the things that I think a lot about is the history of chefs in food service, because if you go back even 50 years ago in the United States, I mean, people didn't go out to restaurants that often. It was a special occasion. And so chefs became really good at special occasion food. And a lot of the things that we like, whether it's a sweet dessert or a large piece of meat and so forth, none of that is necessarily a problem if it's consumed in small amounts. But we've, in a sense, we've exceeded expectations in a way. And now we're at a point where we have the science, but if we're going to make a difference, we have to have a new vision for going forward, and that has to be, yes, there probably has to be policy change, but there needs to be models of delicious food that people want to eat, because at some point, this is not like telling people to wear a seatbelt or wear a motorcycle helmet. If people don't like what they're being offered, they're not going to eat it.
Yeah. And Peggy, earlier you mentioned that many Asians associate meat and protein, basically, with good life and social status and wealth. You can't convince people out of those, can you?
I always believe that as a chef, if we can produce equally, if not better, than what had been given to us and served to us, and prove through good taste and through aesthetics, and give people the same kind of experience as they would in other dining scenarios, then it's easy to actually convince people to adopt a less meat diet, for sure. Especially now with food tech, and there's so much innovation happening in this plant-based food scene, it's actually quite easy to substitute one-to-one. Albeit it's not the only way to consume more plants. We can do so as well through sourcing more biodiverse. We can do so through sourcing locally, working with our farmers to see what is in season. In-season food is always going to be the more nutritious food. And so by doing that, we're also building a much more resilient food system.
And Rafi, I know that you run the Yale Hospitality. What have you been doing with your hospitality services in terms of change of food supply?
At Yale, we inspire to be a transformational hospitality program and a dining program. So we constantly explore new opportunities for new ideas that are in line with our value propositions. And we incubate these ideas in very pragmatic operational solutions. We test them and we measure them, and we see if they are reaching success in any of those areas. And ultimately, we share our best practices with our peers and with the industry. We collaborate at the local level with our purveyors. We collaborate with foundations and institutions such as Good Food Fund, such as Culinary Institute of America, hopefully in the future with the Rockefeller Foundation. And so trying to see how best we can be a change advocate in this process. We also work with the big industry, big manufacturers, through our collaboration with these companies. We challenge them, and we try to investigate good solutions that are not just good for Yale Hospitality, but for broader operators in the United States.
And the reason Eat Lancet authors also proposed an alternative, a universal healthy reference diet that is rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and nuts, and very low on red meat, sugar, and processed foods. So it's such a massive food system transformation, even possible and palatable in the future. Roy?
Absolutely. I mean, we have seen with COVID how quickly human behavior can change if you have to. And it's interesting how COVID, 94% of hospitalizations and deaths are the result of underlying, COVID patients have underlying chronic disease, most of which are diet or age related. And and some people have gone on to say that if we actually were healthy, we're eating the Eat Lancet diet, and we really had healthy populations, COVID would really just be a pretty minor flu. Yeah. But because we have so many underlying health conditions, it's become the disaster that it is. So I think we have to change. It's the food system right now is bankrupting the healthcare system. We're seeing massive increases in healthcare all over the world. And if you take, for example, the United States alone, we're spending $300 billion on one diet-related disease, that's diabetes. That's just one. You think about what you could do with $300 billion to create better livelihoods for farmers and for consumers, etc. So I think that we can't survive if we don't make that change. And human beings have been very good at transforming when they have to transform. I don't think it's going to be easy, though.
I'll just add to that, though,
yes.
that, this is not as though we have to come up with the technology to land a man on Mars. Part of it is making sure that chefs and food producers are really, truly focused on deliciousness, which means not just telling people what to eat less of, but really making plant-based foods delicious. And we have a lot of work to do there. But then some of it is also changing the psychology. I give the example of when I was young, you wanted to buy a stereo system. If you had the money, you wanted to buy the biggest possible stereo system you could. And then along came companies like Apple and other electronic companies that suddenly made us think that the smaller, the better, the more expensive, right? And so some of these things, it's just a matter of what's between our ears, what's in our minds, in terms of how we think about this. So the last thing I'll mention is that there is an issue where a lot of people have come to think that animal-based protein is a higher quality protein than plant-based protein. And as long as you're eating a biodiverse diet, that's just not a problem. And so there's a bit of education to do there.
In what way do you expect that kind of change to happen? Is it top-down or bottom-up? You need more people to have that mindset change in the first place. Greg?
For sure.
Well, I think it has to come across the board. We need policy change. We need chefs on board. We need to start with K through 12 school children. There's a lot of important work going on there in campus dining. What the work that Rocky's doing at Yale is so important. We have a Menus of Change University Research Collaborative working with 60 universities. And so you start where you can make progress the easiest, and you show that it can be successful, and then other people will say, well, look, it's possible, I can build on that.
And Peggy, earlier, Greg mentioned that maybe COVID can be a game changer, because if you cannot convince people into eating more healthy food, well, probably we can scaring them into doing that, because COVID obviously has exposed a lot of problems. Those with obesity, hypertension, and are more easily prone to this virus. Do you think that could be a game changer?
I think with the pandemic, it's already kind of awakened a lot of people in the issues of the fundamental issues of our food system, from food safety to food security. I think that's been completely exposed of when people are completely, when people are low-wage workers, they can't actually make the decisions up top. And so your question earlier was also, who makes these decisions? Should it be from top down or bottom up? Yes, I completely agree that it should come from all angles. And what Greg mentioned as well is that, implementing these curriculums and the studies of what Menus of Change have done, Eat Lancet have done, is absolutely incredible and inspiring. But many people on the bottom don't actually know what to do. And I think we're at this breaking point now to decide what is the next step and how should we achieve the world and the planet that we want to see. And so my suggestion is also to normalize these health supportive culinary techniques, such as raw food treatment, diversifying food ingredients, and fermentation in our curriculums. By doing so, we're also inspiring the chefs to become change makers. So is scaring people the right way? Well, it's happening and it's working. So I think that hopefully we'll see some real changes in China.
All right, we'll take a short break and we'll come back to our discussions on the food systems in the world. Don't go away, we'll be right back. Well, another question I'm going to ask is if change must happen, does it happen simultaneously, indiscriminately, everywhere in the world? So, Rafi, should we distinguish between developed nations and developing countries in terms of their diets, the people's diets?
Absolutely. That's an imperative that was actually identified through Eat Lancet reports. That whereas the global approach has to be somewhat of unified in terms of the deliverables, each country, each region probably has a different approach in terms of achieving their own national dietary guidelines. And so what works in one part of the world not necessarily would work in another part. So regionality has a significant aspect to play in terms of achieving global goals.
Especially those fast emerging economies. Greg, earlier Peggy mentioned India and China. There are 400 million middle-class citizens living in China, and they want to eat better and healthier, but in their minds probably meat and seafood mean that. Do you agree? What is your message to them?
Well, I think Peggy's made a good point, which is there's still a lot of basic education that needs to happen around nutrition and sustainability, so people understand what constitutes an optimally healthy diet, what the connections between their food choices and the environment are. But after that, then we really need to look at how we're going to make the change, because it's not as simple as educating. It's certainly not as simple as making policy change. And that's one of the reasons that we're so focused on kind of a framework that looks at plant forward as a way of increasing choice, not decreasing choice. And if you look at the Eat Lancet report, it doesn't call for a vegan or vegetarian diet, although that can certainly be an option. But if we just look at increasing choices, because in the United States, often the choices are between sort of a regular food choice and a vegetarian food choice. And we don't tend to do much in between, as is the tradition in Asia, quite frankly. In addition to a lot of vegetarian traditions, you have a tradition of making a small amount of animal protein, stretch and flavor a lot of plant-based foods. So I think the challenge in China, in India, is a different challenge. It's related, but it's a different challenge than what we have in the United States and Europe.
And Peggy, I know there is a term that's plant-forward dining. That is a diet focused on eating less animal meat, more fruits, vegetables. And that is a mainstream concept in culinary and food service industry in the advanced economies. What is the appeal of it, and how can you sell this message?
For sure. The term plant-based has really only emerged about 10 years ago. And so plant-forward is really a way to kind of guide people who aren't necessarily plant-based chefs or vegetarian chefs towards normalizing certain ingredients that they would not normally use, such as whole grain lentils, biodiverse plants. And so it's not to scare anyone away from this type of cuisine. What we're trying to do is really encourage chefs to think outside of their usual pantry staples, outside of their usual meats that they would source, and to put vegetables as the focus of the meal, and then encourage them to put the meats as a side dish instead of as a main course. So that's kind of the idea, and it's really by being inclusive throughout this change making, that's how we can get more people on board.
And earlier, Greg mentioned that pure vegetarians and vegans probably only a small percentage of consumers. About 22 consider themselves Flexitarians, as reported by the Culinary Institute of America. How would you encourage those people eating to embrace more plant-forward approach? Peggy?
Sorry, say that again?
I mean, those both eat meat and plants, what we call flexitarians. Can we encourage them to eat more plant-based food?
Well, I think flexitarians already have quite a wide range of idea of how to consume, and not labeling any kind of diets for a certain person might work better for them, because we've always known that restriction is not quite helpful. Restricting someone from what they're used to, what they want, what your body is craving for is not actually the way to be sustainable in the long run. So why not consume, but consume with higher quality? And you can have sugar, but choose the better forms of sugar.
Okay.
Choose the sugars that are more fair trade.
And Rafi, I know that Yale Hospitality has also been doing similar things to promote a more sustainable food system. Can you tell us what kind of practices that you've been making, and does it work?
Yes, we started many years ago a collaboration with Culinary Institute of America that was aimed at improving or enhancing the way chefs develop menus. And through that initiative, there were, I believe, 14 principles. Greg, am I correct? That were developed, and those principles basically helped chefs and food service operators to create menus that promote health and wellness, promote agriculture that is rewarded for its best practices, that actually create nutritious and very flavorful and craveable menus that is focused on how to leverage international cuisine and cultural-based diet as a way to inspire not only the chefs but also the customers to be more inquisitive and curious about these new flavors and these new cuisines. And I think we not only adopted these principles, but we put them into place and we tested them, and they worked. And they work now, and not only for us, but for other operators across a very wide spectrum of the food industry.
No. And the bigger question is what is going on with the food system that is in relation to food security around the world. Roy, would you please weigh in on this? If we continue the way we do now, it will pose challenges to our food security.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the world has been pretty good at describing where we're headed if we don't change. But I think what we need is actually a vision of another future, because we've become very good at describing the world we don't want. You know, if you look at all the movies and books about the future, they're all very negative. They're all very dark. It's a world that no one actually wants to live in. And yet we actually need to have a vision. If we're going to recreate a food system or any system future, we need to really start thinking about what could be rather than what we're worried about. And we recently, last year, we launched, the Rockefeller Foundation launched a food system vision prize to describe the food systems of 2050. And over 1,300 groups all over the world submitted their visions, and we selected the top 10 just recently, one of which is in Beijing, the Good Food Fund. And they're so exciting because they answer the question, what if we make the right decisions? What kind of food system do we have? And it's so appealing. It's where we want to go. And you need that in order to address the fact that if we don't do that, we are going to have massive food insecurity, massive health problems. And so I think we need a contrast to the very dystopian world that we're often facing, so that we can find the creativity and the innovation and the willpower to make the shifts we're talking about.
And another angle to look at this is environment. A lot of people probably don't think that food has any impact on our environment, but you guys seem to be pointing to that direction. Why the failings in food system can also damage our environment, our Mother Nature?
Go ahead, Rob.
No, go ahead, Greg.
No, I was just going to say, I think, I think the damage is well documented. I think what I'm most heartened by is the young people that are very concerned about the future of the planet and climate change are starting to connect our food choices and climate change and the future sustainability and just the prospect of, how do we support a population of 9 to 10 billion people and in about 30 years without, in fact.
But our current food system will not do that.
Right, yeah. So it's, I think it's starting with a positive vision that's evidence-based. We have the evidence now. We know what we need to do. How does that, come into a vision that would be aspirational? And then, what do we need to do in terms of education? So we're now launching a plant-forward culinary arts certification framework in collaboration with Google and other partners, and we're going to roll that out in 2021. It'll be available in China, mostly delivered digitally. But I think that chefs have to be educated for all kinds of occasions, many of them special occasions. But in terms of delivering everyday, healthy, sustainable food, we need to really, no pun intended, start from the ground up. And oftentimes chefs in the past have looked at the world through the lens of special occasion food, through the lens of meat and so forth. Vegetables, grains have been sort of an afterthought. And so, what you put your attention on, you tend to get better at.
But Roy, obviously we need everybody to be at least on the same page to think about food. Is there ongoing international cooperation or between institutions on that?
Yes, well, one of the most exciting things is the United Nations has just announced that there will be a food systems summit in 2021. And what we're finding is that every country in the world is now trying to get engaged with what is the food system that makes sense for them, because every food systems are ultimately local. How do we transform our local food system, creating more, stronger local and regional food supply chains, shifting diets away from ultra-processed foods to more whole foods, to more plant-based forward? How do we do that? And I think that's, if the UN food system is successful, it will really contribute to this movement for food system transformation, which every country in the world needs to address, because the stakes are very high. If we don't make that change, we're destroying the future of the planet, and we're actually making us all sick. So I think there's great motivation to re-envision the food system, or there should be.
Yeah, as the Chinese said, the food is of paramount importance. Thank you very much, Roy. Thank you, Rafi, Greg, and Peggy, for your wonderful, insightful talks. And you've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.